Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Shailen Bhatt, Chief Executive Officer of ITS America.
Good morning. My name is Shailen Bhatt, and I am the President and CEO of the Intelligent Transportation Society of America. And this morning, I'm going to talk to you about the future of transportation. This is an exciting topic that everybody wants to talk about these days. But I thought before I got to the future of transportation and talk about all the cool things that are going to happen and are happening right now, I thought I would talk about why it is so important and why I am so passionate about this. Because when I talk to a lot of people, they feel like the technology is really cool and we're doing it because of this, but there are important reasons behind it. You know, our vision at ITS America is for a better world transformed by intelligent mobility, one that is safer, greener, and smarter. But when you look at the metrics by which we measure this by, we're not doing so well. So last year in America, 37,000 people were killed on our roadways. Globally, 1.3 million. Last year, Americans sat for 97 hours in traffic. 97 hours in traffic at a cost of $87 billion to our economy. And last year, the US transportation sector was responsible for 1/5 of greenhouse gas emissions. So other than that, we're doing a heck of a job. And when I think about those numbers, it takes me back to my time in transportation and why I got started in this. I grew up in Stratford, Ontario, which is a small city just a few hours east of here. And when I was 5 or 6, there was a terrible crash on the highway just east of town. And in that crash, there were 5 high school students who were all killed in one vehicle. And you can imagine in a city in Ontario at that time, what a terrible tragedy that would be. For weeks, you couldn't go anywhere without somebody talking about it. Everybody in town knew somehow somebody that was connected to that crash or had lost a loved one. And I remember that crash stays with me to this day, but not because of the 5 teenagers that were killed in that crash. It stays with me because of the car that they hit. In the car that they hit was a couple, and that couple had 3 kids, but they were not in the car. And so while the rest of the town was mourning the loss of these 5 teenagers, I was consumed by this terror that my parents would do something very routine, like get in their car and go for a drive and never come home. And that fear stays with me to this day. Now, I'm obviously less concerned about, or not less concerned, but just as concerned about my parents as I am about my daughters and my wife now. But there is this all too routine happening in America where we accept that these crashes are part of what needs to happen. Now, I have been the Secretary of Transportation in a couple of states. I was a deputy in a third, and I've been at the Federal Highway Administration. And so if you have hit a pothole or sat in traffic somewhere in the United States in the last 15 years, I probably played a small role in your problem. But every year in transportation, we talk about let's get towards 0 deaths. And every year in my career, we've gone the other way. So when I became the director of the Colorado DOT, the year before I started in 2014, there were 488 fatalities on our system. The next year, we went up to 547. The year after that, we went up to 608. In 2017, there were 648. And in 2018, the year that I left, we had 714 fatalities on our system. And you know, some of those, anytime you are the director of the transportation system, you get an email saying that there's been a fatality. And a lot of these stay with me. I remember there was a young teenage driver. She lost control of the vehicle on a rural roadway. There was a family of 5 in a minivan heading to a church service on a Sunday that was hit by an Amtrak train at an unsignalized crossing. And so many of these crashes that I can recall. A lot of them for a lot of different reasons. Folks not wearing their seatbelt, which is a new technology that's been around for decades. And there are some states that still don't mandate seatbelts. Well, we were at an event trying to get Colorado to pass a primary seatbelt law, and I was a speaker, and then the other speaker was the head of the trauma unit from a local hospital. And he was late, but he had a good reason. Because when he showed up, and we did our presentation afterwards, we were chatting, and he said the reason that he was late was because as he was getting ready to leave the hospital, an ambulance came in and had a crash victim that he had to help try to resuscitate. And they tried everything. They did everything they could, open heart massage, and they didn't get there. And he had to go out and tell the family that their mom, daughter, wife was not coming home. And it took me back to that crash when I was a kid, and I remember thinking to myself, how many thousands of doctors have had to tell millions of families that their parent or child is not coming home? And so I am so passionate about the technology on the transportation side, because a lot of these crashes are completely preventable with technology that is available today. So when you talk to NHTSA will say that 80% of unimpaired crashes are preventable through the deployment of V2X technology. So this is not new stuff, this is not Jetsons, this is technology that is available today. A couple of months ago, there was a terrible crash on I-75 in Kentucky. A family from Michigan hit and killed by a wrong-way driver on I-75. Last year, I was speaking at the University of Michigan, and there was a crash in Indiana where a truck went through the stop bar on a school bus and killed twin brother and sisters and their 9-year-old sibling. Again, this is not rocket science, this is stuff that we can deploy today. And I think we become desensitized when we say things like 37,000 crashes a day. We have engineered an incredible amount of safety into the vehicles. Vehicles today are incredibly safe, but we can do better. We can do better with connected vehicle technologies, and we're going to get to a future that is even more connected and autonomous. So while today we have things like driver assist, and we have things like automatic braking, and these are great, the more that we can connect vehicles to each other, vehicles to the infrastructure, vehicles to vulnerable users of the system, and get to that future of autonomy, we can start to see this trend line, which for the last 6 years for motor vehicle fatalities has gone up and up and up. We can start to see that trend line go down and get towards our vision of zero fatalities. We also talk about this metric of 97 hours sitting in traffic. Now, I just came from Las Vegas for the National Association of Broadcasters conference, and I think virtually everybody here would assume that 97 hours sitting in traffic in a year is a bad thing. But there are folks there who actually feel that that's 97 hours where you are a captive audience, and they want to develop content so that they can interact with you, they can market with you, and sell you products during that time. Now, there may be some sort of virtual reality experience that could make sitting in your car for 97 hours a year a good thing. Myself, I'd rather go home and be with my family as we all sit on our individual devices. But my vision of a future of transportation is not us sitting in cars, sitting in traffic and transforming what is useless time now into productive time. It's how do we end this congestion? And part of that congestion leads to greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the US transportation sector, we are responsible for 1/5 of our greenhouse gas emissions in 2016. Now there's good news here. There is good news here. Just like fatalities used to be above 50,000 and we've got them down into the 30,000 range, on the transportation greenhouse gas emission side, I believe that with electrification of the fleet, which you're seeing more and more, and better operation of our system, we can actually begin to drive this down. Last year I spoke in Beijing, and obviously there are some pretty challenging issues with air quality in many Asian countries. But in all of my time in transportation, we've talked about peak oil, right? We're going to get to peak oil. We're going to run out of oil. We need to get consumption down. And every year we burn more and more oil until this year. China is deploying so many electric buses. They're deploying a fleet the size of London's every month in China. And that is so many electric buses that it's actually going to depress global oil demand by 0.1% this year. So I am a firm believer that with technology, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing that we often don't talk about enough is the fact that 54% of congestion in America comes from non-recurring incidents. So it's not just that when you wake up in the morning and get in your car, our system isn't built to handle the capacity of peak time between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. So our system is massively underbuilt for peak time and massively overbuilt for the rest of the time. But 54% of the congestion comes from non-recurring incidents because it's not the bottleneck of the road that needs to be widened, it's the fact that on our roadways every day we have construction zones, we have crashes, we have car fires. These cause visual distractions which bring down the throughput on our roadways. Well, there are technology solutions that are available here to help us operate the system more effectively. In Shenzhen, they are operating their system maybe even more effectively than we would want to see. So if there's a crash on the system on the highway in Shenzhen, what they do is they notice that there is a disruption in the traffic flow. Their sensors tell them that traffic flow has slowed down. So they zoom in with their cameras, they spot where the traffic obstruction is. They've got video of the crash that occurred, and within 3 minutes, they're able to text the drivers of the vehicle because they're able to pull up their license plate, their driver information. Within 3 minutes, they're able to text those drivers who were involved in that crash and tell them to move their vehicle to the side of the road. That's pretty impressive. That's great clearance. In my time in transportation, when we have a crash, you have first responders that are showing up, you may need a medevac helicopter, fire department shows up, then you have to investigate the crash. The interstate can be closed for hours. Now, we may not want a level of oversight in our society which says that a camera can transmit information to a government authority and get you a text within 3 minutes, but there are incredible opportunities looming with the deployment of machine learning, with big data and algorithms. So, and along with a with connectivity, so that with low latency, we can get user information, system information, and let these vehicles begin making decisions so that we can operate our system much more effectively. In transportation, we talk about 2,000 cars per lane per hour is what an interstate will move, but that is with our current technology. That's assuming that we're able to, folks are not moving at optimal levels, that we're keeping a large distance between these vehicles. Well, with connected vehicle technology, we can get 3,000 vehicles per lane per hour, 4,000 vehicles per lane per hour. I've actually seen some studies that show 6,000. Now that's pretty aggressive. That's with no space between the vehicles at all and everybody moving in concert. But maybe we're going to be able to deal with our capacity issue, not with widening highways, because in many parts of the United States, I actually think that we are at peak highway, but maybe we can get there by just using some striping and some paint and using our shoulders on our system. A new concept that we talk about too is this idea of mobility on demand or mobility as a service. And I think that this is something else that we think about. I got my driver's license in Ontario the day I turned 16, and I think that many people of my vintage would agree that getting your driver's license represented freedom. Last year, I think about 20% of eligible 16-year-olds got their driver's license. That is a massive shift in the way that we experience the world. Now, there are some folks out there who believe that millennials behave a lot like Gen Xers once they get married and they want to move out to the suburbs, but the data isn't showing that right now. What the data is showing is that we don't have as many drivers coming into the system. And so what does that world look like as we move forward? Well, it means that people want mobility options. I think of scooters as a great example. Scooters were not a thing. I actually rode one here at the Detroit Auto Show a couple of years ago, and we filmed it, and it was out on social media. It's like, oh, look at my James Bond impersonation riding around on a scooter. Scooters are everywhere now. Now, not everybody thinks that that is a great thing, but it is a form of micromobility that did not exist a couple of years ago. The other day I was talking to my wife about a trip we're going to take, and I was like, should we rent a car? A very normal practice. And she said, no, you know what? We'll just Uber in from the airport and we'll Airbnb. Those are two verbs that were not nouns 10 years ago. But in transportation, we take 13 years to deliver a major project. So a major project that's being delivered today is one that was being developed when the iPhone was just being launched. It's a totally different world. We have 25-year planning documents that come out. If I had to do a road project today, based on a 25-year-old document, that document would be from 1994, and I would say, my number one challenge is there are all of these malls everywhere, and everybody wants to go to the malls, and how do I build enough transportation to get people into malls? Would anybody in this room assume that getting people into a mall is our number one transportation challenge right now? Not at all. And so we need to understand that that government doesn't move at the same speed as the private sector innovators that we work with. And that's okay. I talk to a lot of friends in the tech world, and they always tell me, I tell my people to fail, but fail quickly. And I think that gets overused a little bit. I think if you fail enough in the private sector, you're encouraged to go fail elsewhere. But I've been appointed by 3 governors and 1 president to lead transportation in the public sector. Nobody has ever told me to fail quickly or slowly. So I think that the private sector needs to understand that there's going to be some time for government to get up to speed, but I think we're going to be able to do it. And I think it's important that we work together on this. And again, I come back to this idea of when the future comes, and whether that is with full autonomy in a couple of decades or 10 to 15 years, or this increasingly mixed fleet of vehicles that are connected, some with these features. How do we design a transportation system that is inclusive and accessible for everybody? I often take transit. How many people took transit to get here today? Anyone? Right. So in this market, transit maybe isn't the option that people look to. I often take transit because I'm trying to reduce my carbon footprint. But for a lot of people in this world, it's not a choice about making a better environmental decision. It's their only chance to get to their job, to get to where they need to go. And so we need to make sure that these systems that we're designing, they're inclusive for everybody. Accessibility. We just released a report around how the design of vehicles doesn't necessarily work for all users of the system. So as we look at a future where you don't necessarily need a steering wheel or pedals in a vehicle to operate it, how do we make decisions today so that the system that we design for the future is accessible to everybody? Because somebody in transportation made this great comment a few months ago, and it said, mobility is the great equalizer. So most of us, we take our mobility for granted, but this future world in which cars can talk to each other and people don't necessarily have to drive, and we can use solutions like micromobility to plan our seamless mobility across all modes, we need to make sure that it is inclusive and accessible. So I'll just close by saying that, in 2016, we had what I call the world's first commercial autonomous vehicle delivery in Colorado. Many of you may know it as the beer run, where we had a truck go 100 miles on the interstate carrying 50,000 pounds of beer, and the driver was in the seat, in the sleeper berth, not in the driver's seat. And at the time, people were like, well, why would you do that? Why did that happen? How could you, there were a couple of legislators that were like, how could you put people's lives at risk? And we designed that test incredibly well. We had state troopers all around that vehicle. And in fact, the number one thing that they wanted to talk to me about was not potholes or bridges. They wanted to talk about striping. And I can promise you, on the public side, nobody has ever gone to a public meeting and yelled at somebody like me because of the striping. But we did that test, and then that company went, and now they are doing testing all over the United States, and we've moved that forward. But on that same stretch of highway where we did that test a few months later, there was a state trooper, Cody Donahue, who was killed by a commercial vehicle that drifted across the fog line and struck him while he was investigating a crash on I-25 in Colorado. And I actually knew him pretty well because he had been on the governor's executive protective unit, and we had worked together. And if you knew him, he was this big hulk of a man, like a foot taller than me, and probably the same weight, but his was muscle, not like mine. And he's the kind of person that you think, this is the kind of person who could never be hurt in the line of duty. And Cody Donahue was one of the 37,000 fatalities that occurred last year. So all of these people, we need to make strides. We need to continue to deploy this technology. We need to make sure we do it safely. We need to make sure that when there is a tragedy, like what happened in Tempe last year, that we investigate fully why the technology made a mistake. But I am convinced that if we are resolute, that we move forward with this idea that we're not deploying technology for technology's sake, but we are doing it because we're trying to create a world that is safer, that is smarter, and is greener, I think we'll all be successful. So thank you very much for your time today, and please continue doing what you're doing because it's incredibly important. Thank you very much.